The story opens not with a conversation, but with a visceral act of erasure. Vivian Harrison stands in the center of her grand foyer, her face illuminated by the flickering orange glow of a metal bin. In her hand is her wedding portrait, the symbol of 10 years of loyalty, which she watches curl into ash. From the shadows of the grand staircase, Paris Jordan, clad in a provocative red silk dress that signals her invasion, mocks Vivian's years of service. Grant Harrison, the man Vivian built an empire for, walks in with a 7-year-old boy, Leo, who calls him Daddy. Grant doesn't offer a greeting. He offers a relocation order, telling Vivian that her 10-year audition for the role of his wife is over because Paris has already provided the one thing Vivian couldn't, a male heir. The scent of expensive cigars and rain clung to Grant Harrison as he stepped into the foyer of the Harrison estate. Vivian stood at the foot of the mahogany staircase, her heart hammering against her ribs. In her hand, she squeezed a velvet box containing a custom-made watch, engraved with the date of their 10th anniversary. For a decade, she had been the invisible pillar of his life, the woman who traded her own lethal brilliance for the quiet role of a Mafia don's wife. "Grant, you're home," she whispered, stepping forward to greet him. "Happy anniversary." Grant didn't stop to take the box. He didn't even look at her. Instead, he stepped aside to reveal a woman draped in a crimson silk dress that looked like a fresh wound against the white marble floor. Beside her stood a young boy, no older than 7, with Grant's unmistakable sharp jawline and arrogant tilt of the head. "The anniversary is over, Vivian," Grant said, his voice as cold as a morgue slab. He gestured to the woman. "This is Paris Jordan, and the boy is Leo, my son." The velvet box slipped from Vivian's fingers, hitting the floor with a hollow thud. The watch, a symbol of 10 years of shared secrets and sacrifices, shattered under the weight of the silence. "Daddy, is this the lady who's been looking after our house?" Leo asked, his voice high and innocent, yet cutting deeper than any blade Vivian had ever used in her former life. Paris stepped forward, her heels clicking like a countdown. She didn't look like a mistress, she looked like a conqueror. She reached out and plucked a stray hair from Grant's lapel, her eyes locking onto Vivian, with a predatory gleam. "It's such a big house for just one woman, isn't it, Grant? I'm so glad we're finally home." Vivian felt the world tilt. 10 years, Grant. I gave you my life. I gave up everything to make sure you reached the top, and you bring this into our home." "I brought a legacy home," Grant snapped, finally turning to look at her. His eyes held no warmth, only a chilling pragmatism. "You've been a loyal wife, Vivian, but you failed in your primary duty. You gave me no heir. Paris has. From tonight, she and Leo will be staying in the master suite. You can move your things to the guest wing. Consider it a promotion to estate manager. You know how this house runs better than anyone. It would be a waste to throw you out now." Vivian looked at the man she had loved, then at the woman already claiming her space. A single tear escaped, hot and bitter, tracking down her cheek. Grant thought he was demoting a housewife. He had no idea he was unchaining the Reaper. The smoke from the burning photograph curled around Grant's polished Italian leather shoes, but he didn't recoil. He looked down at the charred remains of their wedding day with the same detached indifference he used to check a ledger. 10 years, Grant," Vivian's voice was a jagged shard of glass. She stood by the fireplace, her knuckles white as she gripped the mantle. 10 years of cleaning your blood off the floor, of hiding your secrets, of being the ghost in this house so you could be the king of the city. And you bring her here, you bring him here." Grant adjusted his cufflinks, the cold blue light of the foyer catching the sharp angles of his face. He didn't look at Vivian. He looked at Leo, who was currently tracing the gold gilding on a vase worth more than a common man's life. Paris stood behind the boy, her hand resting possessively on Grant's forearm, her red dress a literal bloodstain on Vivian's carefully curated life. "Vivian, don't be tedious," Grant finally spoke. His voice was a low, rhythmic rumble that used to make her feel safe, but now it only made her skin crawl. "We had an agreement. You were to provide the next generation of the Harrison line. You've had a decade. My patience isn't infinite." "An agreement?" Vivian choked out a bitter laugh, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path through the soot on her cheek. "I gave you my life. I gave you my loyalty." "Loyalty is expected. An heir is required," Grant countered, finally meeting her gaze with eyes like flint. "Paris has done in one night what you couldn't do in 3,000. She is the mother of my heir. Leo is a Harrison. He carries my blood, my name, and one day he will carry my crown." Paris leaned in, her voice a sugary poison. "It's just biology, Vivian. A man like Grant needs a legacy. You should be happy for him. You've always said you wanted what was best for the family." "You are not the family," Vivian hissed. Grant stepped forward, invading Vivian's space until she could smell his expensive cologne and the faint scent of gunpowder that always clung to him. "Actually, Vivian, as of today, she is. I've already had the lawyers draft the papers. You'll stay on as the estate manager. You know the staff, you know the security protocols. It would be inconvenient to replace you entirely right now." He reached out, his fingers grazing her chin almost tenderly, though his words were a death sentence. "Stay in the guest wing. Keep the house running. Be grateful I'm not throwing you to the rivals you helped me create. Paris needs the master suite. She needs to be comfortable while she prepares Leo for his future." He turned his back on her then, dismissing a decade of devotion as if it were a spent casing. As the trio walked toward the stairs, Vivian's hand instinctively went to her stomach, shielding the secret life Grant didn't deserve to know about. The heat of the fire at her back was nothing compared to the cold, digital fire beginning to roar in her mind. Grant thought he had just brought home his legacy. He had no idea he had just hand-delivered his executioner. The transition from wife to servant happened with a chilling, systematic cruelty. Grant didn't just break their vows, he sought to erase her dignity. By the second week, the master's suite, the room Vivian had curated with ivory linens and the scent of jasmine, was off-limits. Paris had moved in, and with her came a chaotic trail of designer shopping bags and the pungent smell of expensive, cloying perfume. "Vivian, the boy is hungry. Why isn't the organic salmon ready?" Grant's voice boomed from the dining hall, cold and devoid of the affection that had once anchored her world. Vivian stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she plated the fish. The morning sickness was a constant, silent battle behind her ribs, but she swallowed the bile, masking her pregnancy behind a loose-fitting apron. She moved into the dining room, placing the plate before 7-year-old Leo. The boy looked up at her, his eyes reflecting his mother's practiced malice. "I don't like the green bits," Leo whined, shoving the plate away so hard the sauce splattered onto Vivian's hand. "Then don't eat them, darling," Paris cooed, reclining in the chair Vivian had sat in for a decade. She leaned back, extending a shapely leg clad in red silk. "Vivian, be a dear and clean that up. And while you're down there, my heels are scuffed. There's a kit in the mudroom." Vivian felt the heat of 1,000 suns rising in her chest, but she dropped to her knees. As she wiped the floor, she watched Grant. He didn't look away from his tablet. He didn't flinch at the sight of his wife kneeling at the feet of his mistress. He treated her like a piece of the architecture, functional, silent, and beneath his notice. "Grant," Vivian whispered, her voice a low rasp. 10 years. I helped you build the Harrison Port Authority. I laundered the reputations of your captains. Does that mean nothing?" Grant finally looked up, his eyes like flint. "You were paid in protection and luxury, Vivian, but a boss needs a legacy. Paris gave me a son, you gave me spreadsheets. If you want to stay under this roof, learn your new rank. You aren't the queen anymore, you're the help." Paris let out a soft, melodic laugh, reaching out to stroke Grant's cheek. "Don't be so hard on her, Grant. She's actually quite good at the laundry. Though I did find a stain on your silk shirt this morning. Make sure she scrubs it harder next time." Vivian kept her head down, the damp cloth tight in her fist. They saw a broken woman. They saw a housewife with nowhere to go. They didn't see the way her mind was already calculating the decryption codes for Grant's private ledgers. Every insult Paris hurled was another zero she would soon subtract from Grant's net worth. As she polished Paris's shoes, Vivian wasn't crying anymore. She was counting down the seconds until the Reaper came for her due. The grand foyer of the Harrison estate still smelled of the expensive, cloying perfume Paris had sprayed everywhere, a scent that felt like a physical invasion of Vivian's territory. Upstairs, she could hear the muffled sounds of Leo laughing and Grant's deep, rare chuckle, a sound he hadn't gifted Vivian in years. Vivian sat on the edge of the cold marble bathtub in her private dressing room, the only place the mistress hadn't yet touched. Her hands trembled as she reached into the hidden compartment of her vanity, pulling out a small, crumpled envelope she had intercepted from the private courier earlier that afternoon. She took a jagged breath and pulled out the glossy black-and-white thermal image. There, amidst the grainy shadows, was a tiny, pulsing flicker of life, a miracle she had prayed for throughout a decade of cold nights and lonely gala events. 6 weeks, she whispered, her thumb tracing the edge of the ultrasound. A single tear, hot and bitter, carved a path through the makeup she wore like armor. For 10 years, she had endured Grant's coldness, his late nights, and his family's biting remarks about her barrenness. She had stayed silent, using her genius to quietly erase his enemies and stabilize his shipping routes, all while playing the part of the devoted, quiet wife. She had thought a child would be the bridge back to his heart. But as the laughter from the hallway grew louder, the irony tasted like ash in her mouth. She was finally carrying the Harrison heir, but the master of the house had already replaced her with a ready-made legacy. He had brought a stranger into their bed and a child into their home, labeling Vivian as nothing more than a glorified servant who had outlived her usefulness. A sharp knock at the door made her heart lurch. She shoved the ultrasound into her silk robe just as the door swung open. Grant stood there, already stripping off his blazer, his expression one of bored irritation. "Why are you hiding in here? Paris wants tea, and the help is busy with Leo's luggage," he said, not even looking at her eyes. "And move your things to the guest wing by morning. I don't want Paris feeling like an intruder in her own home." Vivian felt the tiny life inside her stir, a phantom spark of protective rage. She looked at the man she had loved, the man she had built into a king, and realized he was just a fool playing with fire. "In her own home?" Vivian asked, her voice eerily calm, the tears already drying into a cold mask. "Don't start, Vivian. You've had 10 years to give me what I needed. You failed. Paris didn't," he snapped, turning his back on her. Vivian's hand tightened over the ultrasound in her pocket. She wasn't just a wife anymore, she was a mother. And if Grant Harrison wanted a war over a legacy, she would show him exactly what the Silent Reaper did to those who threatened hers. She wouldn't tell him. Not yet. He didn't deserve to know his real heir was already plotting his ruin. The crystal chandeliers of the Harrison ballroom vibrated with the forced laughter of 1,000 lies. Vivian stood at the periphery, her high-collared black silk gown concealing the faint, protective curve of her abdomen. Across the room, Grant was a portrait of stolen prestige, his arm draped possessively around Paris. Paris wore a crimson dress that screamed of her victory, while little Leo stood beside them, being introduced to the city's elite as the rightful Harrison heir. Grant's eyes met Vivian's for a fleeting second, cold, dismissive, and utterly devoid of the 10 years they had shared. He leaned into Paris, whispering something that made her giggle, a sound like glass breaking in Vivian's ears. Then the world turned red. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows detonated inward. Shards of glass rained down like diamonds soaked in gasoline. The music died in a chorus of screams as masked gunmen in tactical gear swarmed the balcony. "Assassins!" someone shrieked, but the word was drowned out by the rhythmic thud of suppressed gunfire. Grant's instincts as a mafia boss kicked in instantly, but his loyalty was a jagged blade. As the first volley of bullets tore through the floral arrangements, he lunged, not toward his wife of a decade, but toward the woman in red. "Grant!" Vivian shouted, her hand instinctively reaching for him, her other hand shielding her stomach. A bullet hissed past her ear, shattering a marble pillar behind her. Grant didn't even look back. He scooped Leo into his arms with one hand and wrapped his other arm around Paris's waist, dragging them toward the reinforced safe room behind the dais. "Grant, help me!" Vivian's voice cracked, a rare moment of vulnerability surfacing through her hardening shell. She was trapped between the buffet tables and a line of advancing gunmen. Grant paused at the heavy steel door of the vault. For a heartbeat, their eyes locked. He saw his wife, the woman who had scrubbed blood off his hands for years, cornered and defenseless. Then he looked at Paris, who whimpered against his chest. "I have to protect my blood, Vivian," he shouted over the chaos. "You've always been a survivor. Figure it out." The heavy vault door slammed shut with a final metallic thud, sealing Grant, his mistress, and his son inside. Vivian stood alone in the kill zone. The gunmen leveled their rifles, the red laser dots dancing across her chest. In that moment of absolute abandonment, the submissive wife died. The tear that had been tracing its way down her cheek didn't fall. It evaporated in the heat of her rising fury. As the lead assassin squeezed the trigger, Vivian didn't scream. She dove behind a fallen mahogany table, her movements suddenly blurring with a lethal, professional grace Grant had never seen. Her fingers found the hidden release catch beneath the table, a backup weapon she had installed years ago for his protection. The Silent Reaper didn't need a vault to stay alive. She needed a target. And as she gripped the cold steel of the handgun, she realized Grant Harrison had just made the last mistake of his life. The sirens of the gala were drowned out by the rhythmic, deafening cracks of gunfire. The grand ballroom, once a sea of silk and champagne, had transformed into a kill zone. Vivian crouched behind a tipped mahogany table, her hand instinctively shielding her stomach. The sharp scent of gunpowder bit at her nose, but it was the coldness in her heart that made it hard to breathe. 10 yards away, Grant stood near the reinforced exit, his tactical team forming a human wall around him. He wasn't looking for her. His arms were wrapped tightly around Paris, who was trembling in her crimson dress, while his other hand gripped Leo's shoulder, pulling the boy into the safety of the armored corridor. "Grant," Vivian's voice was a ragged plea, barely audible over the shattering of the crystal chandeliers above her. "Grant, I'm hit. I can't reach you." A stray bullet hissed past her ear, splintering the wood of the table. She looked up, her eyes locking onto his. For a heartbeat, time suspended. She expected to see the man who had promised to protect her for 10 years. She expected the Mafia boss who leveled cities for his interests to turn back for his wife. Instead, she saw a stranger. Grant's eyes were devoid of panic or love. They were filled with a cold, transactional calculation. He looked at her bleeding shoulder, then at the son who carried his name, and finally at the mistress who had given him the legacy he craved. "Seal the doors," Grant commanded, his voice booming with a terrifying lack of hesitation. "Grant, no." Vivian lunged forward, her fingers brushing the cold marble floor as she tried to bridge the gap. "I'm still here. Our baby is still here." He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply turned his back on her, ushering Paris and Leo into the darkness of the secure tunnel. As the heavy steel doors began to hiss shut, the last thing Vivian saw through the narrowing gap was the smug, triumphant silhouette of Paris leaning into Grant's chest. The click of the lock was the loudest sound in the room. Vivian collapsed back against the table, the heat of the fire behind her contrasting with the ice in her veins. She was alone in the line of fire, surrounded by enemies, discarded like a used-up shell casing by the man she had built a throne for. A shadow loomed over her, a rival gunman raising his weapon. In that moment, the submissive wife died. The grief in Vivian's eyes burned away, replaced by a terrifying, crystalline clarity. As the gunman pulled the trigger, Vivian didn't scream. She moved with a lethal, blurred precision she hadn't used in a decade. Grant hadn't just left his wife behind. He had left the only person capable of saving him. And as she felt her own pulse thundering in her ears, Vivian made a silent vow. He would pray for the mercy of those gunmen before she was through with him. The wreckage of the Harrison Gala was still smoldering when the first news reports hit the wire. Rain began to fall, mixing with the soot and blood on the pavement, but Grant Harrison didn't feel the cold. He stood under a black umbrella held by one of his guards, staring at the charred skeletal remains of the SUV that had been intercepted by the rival Cavani hit squad. The vehicle was caught in the direct line of the blast, boss, his lead enforcer whispered, his voice trembling. "There were no survivors. We found the wedding ring near the chassis. It was fused to the metal." Grant took the small, blackened circle of gold. 10 years of marriage. incinerated in 10 seconds of cowardice. He remembered the look on Vivian's face when he had shoved her aside to shield Paris and Leo, the way her eyes hadn't shown fear, but a sudden, terrifying clarity. He had told himself it was a tactical choice. He had told himself a mafia boss needs an heir more than a wife. But as the flashing blue lights of the ambulances reflected in the puddles, the silence of the estate felt deafening. By morning, the headlines were clinical. Wife of prominent businessman Grant Harrison confirmed dead in terrorist ambush. Inside the Harrison mansion, Paris was already moving her silk robes into Vivian's walk-in closet. She hummed a low tune, tossing Vivian's understated designer dresses into trash bags. "It's a tragedy, Grant, truly," Paris said, not looking up as he entered the room. "But the boy needs stability. We should announce our engagement soon to show the commission you aren't weakened by this loss." Grant looked at the empty space on the bed where Vivian had slept for a decade. He expected to feel relief, the shedding of a burden that had held back his real family. Instead, he felt a strange, creeping chill. The house felt lighter, but in a way that suggested the foundation had been removed. Miles away, in a windowless room illuminated only by the rhythmic pulse of blue server lights, a woman sat in a high-backed leather chair. She didn't look like the broken housewife who had wept over a burning photograph. Her hair was slicked back, her gaze sharp and predatory. Vivian Harrison watched the news report of her own death on a massive wall of monitors. She reached out and touched the screen, trailing her finger over Grant's stoic face. "The wife is dead, Grant," she whispered, her voice devoid of the warmth he had taken for granted. "But the Reaper is just waking up." With a single keystroke, she executed a command that had been dormant for 10 years. Across the globe, encrypted nodes flickered to life. The Silent Reaper was back online, and her first order of business was to ensure that while she was dead to the world, Grant Harrison would soon wish he was too. The transition from the rain-slicked streets to the sterile, pressurized hum of the underground bunker was the first breath of clean air Vivian had taken in a decade. As the heavy blast doors sealed with a hydraulic hiss, the soft, amber glow of the emergency lights sensed her DNA, shifting instantly to a predatory electric blue. She stripped off the tattered, blood-stained coat, the last remnant of the submissive wife Grant Harrison thought he had broken, and tossed it into a disposal chute. In the reflection of the floor-to-ceiling monitors, Vivian didn't see a grieving widow or a discarded mistress. She saw the Silent Reaper. "Welcome back, Alpha," a smooth, synthesized voice resonated through the chamber. "The global network has been dormant for 3,652 days. Shall I initiate a full system wake-up?" "Do it, Ares," Vivian commanded, her voice devoid of the tremor that had defined her marriage. With a rhythmic mechanical thrum, the darkened room came to life. Tens of thousands of data streams began to cascade across the walls, scrolling code, satellite feeds, and encrypted financial ledgers. This was her true kingdom. While Grant was busy playing king of a local syndicate, Vivian had built the invisible threads that connected the world's elite. She sat at the central console, her fingers hovering over the glass interface. For years, she had used her genius to scrub Grant's digital footprints, to hide his crimes, and to grow his wealth. She had been his guardian angel, and he had repaid her by leaving her to die in an alleyway. "Ares, run a diagnostic on the Harrison Syndicate's primary holdings," she ordered. Her eyes tracked a flickering red dot on the screen. The GPS signature of the car Grant was currently using to drive Paris and his supposed heir to dinner. "Diagnostic complete. The Harrison portfolio is currently valued at $400 million. 70% of that is routed through shell companies you created, Alpha." Vivian's lips curled into a cold, sharp smile. She reached out and touched the screen, highlighting Grant's face. "He thinks I'm a ghost. He thinks I'm a memory." She began to type, her movements a blur of lethal precision. With every keystroke, she wasn't just coding, she was severing. She began to revoke the digital permissions that gave Grant access to his own life. "Grant once told me that a king needs an heir to be immortal," she whispered to the empty room, her eyes cold as ice. "But he forgot that a king is nothing without his kingdom. Tonight, the Reaper wakes up. And by dawn, Grant Harrison will realize that the woman he threw away was the only thing keeping his world from burning. She hit the enter key, and 1,000 miles away, the first of Grant's offshore accounts vanished into thin air. The hunt had begun. Grant Harrison sat in his leather-bound chair, the amber liquid in his crystal glass swirling as he stared at the security feed of the guest wing. He watched Paris laughing as she tucked Leo into bed, a domestic scene he had traded 10 years of marriage to achieve. He felt a surge of cold pride. Vivian was gone, likely shivering in some cheap motel, finally realizing that her quiet devotion was a currency that had long since devalued. "Power is the only thing that lasts," Grant muttered, reaching for his encrypted laptop. He needed to finalize the transfer of $50 million from his primary offshore account in the Cayman Islands to fund the next shipment of high-grade tech. This move would cement his standing with the commission. He entered his 24-character biometric key. The screen flickered. Usually the interface was a steady, dull blue, but tonight, a strange glitch pulsed across the monitor, a rhythmic, crimson heartbeat. "What is this?" he hissed, his fingers flying across the keys. He forced his way into the ledger. His breath hitched. The balance column, which should have displayed a staggering 8-figure sum, was fluctuating wildly. The numbers were spinning backward, a digital countdown that moved faster than the eye could follow. Million by million, his life's work was evaporating. "No, no, no," Grant roared, slamming his fist onto the mahogany desk. He attempted to initiate a freeze, but the system rejected his overrides. A small dialogue box popped up in the center of the screen. It wasn't a standard system error. It was a single line of text. "Audit in progress. Loyalty is a debt you forgot to pay." Grant's blood turned to ice. That phrasing, it was the signature of the Silent Reaper, the legendary ghost broker he had spent years trying to put on his payroll. But the Reaper worked for no one. Why were they targeting him? Suddenly, the spinning numbers stopped. $0. The screen went black for a second before a new image uploaded. It was the photo of his wedding day, the one Vivian had been burning in the foyer. But this version wasn't burned. It was a high-resolution digital file, and as he watched, a red line was drawn slowly through his face, while Vivian's image remained crystal clear. A notification pinged on his encrypted phone. It was a message from his chief of security. "Boss, the Cayman Bank just called. They said the account was closed via a level 5 priority clearance. They thought it was you." Grant looked at the empty glass in his hand. For the first time in a decade, the man who owned the city felt the cold shiver of a hunted animal. He had brought a mistress into his home to secure his legacy, but in doing so, he had invited a predator to dismantle his world. The first strike had landed, and it hadn't come from a rival mob. It had come from the woman who used to make his coffee every morning. The Harrison estate had never felt more like a mausoleum than it did under Paris Jordan's reign. While Grant was away at an emergency, meeting with the board, desperately trying to trace the millions vanishing from his accounts, Paris sat at the head of the mahogany dining table, sipping a vintage Bordeaux that had been in the Harrison cellar for decades. Vivian watched from the shadows of the doorway, her presence as silent as a ghost. To Paris, she was still the broken estate manager, a woman too shattered to fight back. But Vivian's eyes were not on the woman. They were on the burner phone tucked discreetly beneath Paris's silk napkin. A muffled vibration cut through the silence. Paris didn't check for Grant. Instead, her posture shifted instantly. The soft, seductive mistress vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating professional. She glanced toward the hallway, unaware of Vivian's surveillance, and answered in a voice that was low, sharp, and stripped of its honeyed accent. "The diversion worked," Paris whispered into the receiver. "Grant is spiraling. He thinks it's a rival syndicate or a glitch in his encryption. He has no idea the back door is already wide open." Vivian's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady. She adjusted the microscopic transmitter hidden in her necklace, capturing every word. "What about the boy?" The voice on the other end crackled, a voice Vivian recognized as Julian Vane, Grant's fiercest competitor. Paris let out a dry, mocking laugh. "Leo is playing his part perfectly. Grant is so blinded by the idea of a blood heir that he hasn't questioned the DNA results I forged. He's protecting a child that isn't even his while his real legacy burns to the ground. Once the transfer is complete, I'll leave him with nothing but the bill. She hung up, a smug smile playing on her lips as she took another sip of wine. She believed she was the smartest person in the room, the predator who had successfully infiltrated the lion's den. In the shadows, Vivian felt a cold sense of irony wash over her. Grant had traded 10 years of absolute loyalty for a Trojan horse. He had brought a viper into his bed, thinking it was a prize, all while casting aside the only woman who could have saved him. Vivian retreated into the darkness of the library, her fingers flying across a slim, encrypted tablet. She didn't just have the leverage to destroy Grant anymore. She had the proof that his new family was a calculated hit. "You wanted a legacy, Grant," Vivian whispered to the empty room, her eyes glowing with the reflected light of the screen. "Now you're going to watch your mistress and your enemy take everything you own, and I'm going to be the one who lets them, until it's time for the Reaper to collect." The Harrison estate, once a fortress of cold marble and ironclad security, now felt like a mausoleum. For Grant, the silence was louder than any explosion he'd survived in the underworld. It had been weeks since Vivian died in the hospital after the ambush, yet her presence saturated the air like a lingering scent of expensive perfume and betrayal. Grant sat in his darkened study, the blue glow of security monitors reflecting in his hollow eyes. Beside him, Paris paced restlessly, her red silk heels clicking against the floor, a sound that used to signal seduction but now only grated on his nerves. "The servers are flickering again, Grant," Paris hissed, clutching her glass of wine so hard her knuckles turned white. "The lights in the nursery turned on at 3:00 a.m. Leo is terrified. He says he sees a woman standing by the koi pond." "It's the grid, Paris. The storm damaged the relays," Grant growled, though his hand trembled as he poured a drink. Suddenly, every monitor in the room went to static. A low, rhythmic humming began to vibrate through the floorboards, the melody of the song played at their wedding. Grant surged to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Security! Check the perimeter!" The intercom crackled to life, but it wasn't the head of security who spoke. It was a voice, cool, digitized, and hauntingly familiar. 10 years of secrets, Grant. Did you really think you could bury them all in one shallow grave? "Vivian," Grant whispered, his face draining of color. On the main screen, the static cleared. It wasn't a live feed of the grounds. It was a scrolling list of Grant's private ledgers, his hidden black site locations, and the encrypted files of the Harrison syndicate. A red digital line slashed through each name, one by one. "Someone is inside the system," Paris screamed, pointing at the laptop on the desk. "Shut it down." Grant lunged for the power cable, but the electronic locks on the study doors engaged with a heavy, final thud. The lights plummeted into darkness, leaving only the burning orange glow of the digital Reaper icon on the wall-sized monitor. The smart home system began to cycle rapidly, curtains snapping open and shut, thermostats dropping to freezing levels, and the security sirens wailing in a morning cadence. In the reflection of the glass, Grant saw a silhouette standing behind him. He spun around, gun drawn, but there was only empty air and the smell of the very flowers Vivian used to plant in the garden. He was a Mafia boss, a king of the streets, but in this moment, he was a man being hunted by a ghost he had created. He realized with a jolt of pure terror that Vivian hadn't just left him, she had turned his sanctuary into his cage. The hunt had begun. Grant sat in his darkened study, the glowing embers of a cigar the only light reflecting off the mahogany desk that once felt like a throne. Now, it felt like a raft in the middle of a shipwreck. His empire was hemorrhaging. 3 offshore accounts had been zeroed out in 48 hours. His encrypted logistics network was blinking red with access denied prompts, and his most loyal captains were whispering about a curse. "Find them," Grant growled, his voice raspy from days of sleeplessness. Across from him, his head of security, Miller, looked pale. "Sir, we've tried every specialist in the tri-state area. Whoever is doing this isn't just a hacker. They're a ghost. They're using military-grade backdoors we didn't even know existed. Grant slammed his fist on the desk, the vibration rattling the empty crystal decanter. There is always someone better. I don't care about the cost. Call the broker in Geneva. Tell them I need the Reaper. The name hung in the air like a cold draft. The Silent Reaper was a myth in the underworld, a digital deity who could topple governments and erase bloodlines with a single keystroke. No one knew the Reaper's face, gender, or location. They only knew the price was astronomical and the results were absolute. "Sir, the Reaper doesn't take private contracts for domestic disputes," Miller whispered. "This isn't a dispute, it's an execution," Grant roared. "My money is gone, my shipments are being seized by the feds before they even hit the docks, and Paris is breathing down my neck about her allowance. If the Reaper can find my money, I'll pay double the commission." Grant grabbed his laptop, his fingers trembling with a mix of rage and desperation as he logged into the dark web portal Miller provided. He typed the request himself, his arrogance still blinding him. "I am Grant Harrison. I require the location of the thief who breached my accounts. Name your price." Miles away, in a sleek, minimalist penthouse overlooking the city's skyline, a monitor flickered to life. The blue light washed over Vivian's face, highlighting the sharp, cold determination in her eyes. She sat in a high-backed, ergonomic chair, a glass of ice water beside her, her fingers dancing over a custom mechanical keyboard. A notification popped up, new inquiry for the Reaper. Vivian leaned back, a ghost of a smirk playing on her lips as she read Grant's desperate plea. He was offering her own money to find herself. He was begging the Silent Reaper for mercy, never imagining that the legendary shadow he feared was the same woman he had once called useless and a failed wife. She took a slow sip of water, watching the cursor blink. She didn't hit decline. Instead, she typed a single word back, her heart cold and steady. "Accepted." The trap was set. Grant was no longer just losing his money. He was inviting the fox into the hen house, hand-delivering the final keys to his destruction. Vivian watched the connection logs stabilize. She would take his double commission, and then she would take everything else. Vivian sat in the glow of 3 monitors in her underground sanctum, her fingers dancing across the keys with lethal precision. For 10 years, she had used her brilliance to shield Grant's empire, but tonight, she was a ghost in his machine, pulling at the threads of his reality until it began to unravel. Grant's obsession with legacy had been the dagger he used to twist her heart. He had discarded a decade of devotion for the sake of a bloodline, for Leo, the boy who now slept in the bedroom that should have been her daughter's nursery. But as Vivian bypassed the encrypted firewall of the high-end fertility clinic Paris had visited years ago, a different truth began to emerge from the digital shadows. She pulled up the biological records, her eyes narrowing as the DNA sequencing data scrolled past. Grant was a man of absolute ego, a man who believed his blood was gold. He hadn't bothered to double-check the paternity. Paris's arrival with a child who shared his dark hair and defiant stare had been enough to blind him. "Let's see how pure your legacy really is, Grant," Vivian whispered, her voice cold and devoid of the warmth she once gave him. She cross-referenced Leo's genetic markers with the syndicate's internal database, a library of DNA she had secretly compiled for security purposes over the years. The match didn't link to Grant Harrison. Instead, a red notification flashed on the screen, linking the boy to a man Grant had executed 5 years ago, Marco Rossi, Grant's most hated rival and Paris's former lover. A sharp, hollow laugh escaped Vivian's lips. The betrayal was deeper than she had imagined. Paris wasn't just a mistress, she was a Trojan horse. She had planted a rival's seed in the heart of the Harrison empire, and Grant, blinded by his own arrogance and desire to hurt Vivian, had welcomed the cuckoo into his nest. Vivian leaned back, the blue light of the screens reflecting in her eyes. She felt a flicker of the Silent Reaper's cold satisfaction. Grant had abandoned his pregnant wife and his true blood for a lie constructed by his enemy. He was raising the son of the man he killed, preparing to hand his kingdom to a ghost. She didn't reveal the truth yet. That would be too merciful. She saved the files to an encrypted drive, her mind already moving to the next phase of the collapse. She would let Grant continue to dote on the boy. She would let him believe he had won. The fall is always more devastating when you believe you are standing on the summit. "You traded a diamond for a stone, Grant," she murmured, shutting down the monitors. "And the stone is about to shatter everything you have left." The walls of the Harrison estate, once a fortress of untouchable power, now felt like they were closing in on Grant. Every time he picked up his phone, a new pillar of his life collapsed. It started with the logistics. 3 major shipments of high-end tech, the backbone of his quarterly revenue, had vanished into thin air, diverted by a ghost signal that overrode his most secure protocols. Then came the betrayal of the banks. His offshore accounts, the ones even the feds couldn't trace, were being bled dry at a rate of $10,000 a second. "Find them," Grant roared, hurling a crystal decanter against the marble fireplace. The glass shattered, much like his composure. "I pay for the best cybersecurity in the world. How is a ghost walking through our firewalls?" His lead tech specialist, a man who usually exuded arrogance, was pale, his fingers trembling over his laptop. "Sir, it's not just a hack. Whoever is doing this isn't breaking in, they're using master keys. It's as if the system recognizes them as the rightful owner. We're being locked out of our own empire." In the corner of the room, Paris paced nervously, the red silk of her dress no longer looking like a victory lap, but a target. Leo sat on the sofa, crying for attention that Grant no longer had the patience to give. The happy family Grant had traded a decade of loyalty for was now nothing more than a source of noise and irritation. "Shut that kid up, Paris," Grant snapped, his eyes bloodshot. "Don't yell at us," Paris hissed back, her facade of sweetness finally cracking. "You promised me security, Grant. You said the boring wife was the only thing holding you back. If the money is gone, what are we even doing here?" Grant looked at her, and for the first time, he saw the hollowness in her eyes. Without the crown of his wealth, the mistress's love was rapidly evaporating. Suddenly, every screen in the room flickered. The security monitors, the laptops, even the smart TV on the wall went black. Then, a single line of text appeared in blood-red code. "The debt is due." Grant felt a cold sweat break across his neck. He remembered Vivian's face in the firelight, the way she hadn't screamed or begged when he told her she was replaced. He had called her a maid, a placeholder, a woman whose only value was her service. But as his empire turned into a digital graveyard, a terrifying thought took root in his mind. He hadn't just lost a wife, he had evicted the only person who knew how to keep the monsters at bay. And now, the monster was her. The grand hall of the Continental Hotel was a cavern of cold marble and gilded arrogance. Tonight, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the heavy, metallic tang of unspoken threats. The Mafia Commission, the 7 heads of the most powerful syndicates, sat at a mahogany table that felt more like an altar for a sacrifice. Grant Harrison adjusted his cufflinks, his chest swelling as he walked toward his reserved seat. He felt invincible. Behind him, Paris hovered, wearing a smirk as sharp as the diamonds at her throat. She leaned in, whispering, "Tonight, you aren't just a boss, Grant. You're the king." Grant squeezed her hand, casting a dismissive glance at the empty chair at the head of the table. That seat belonged to the Silent Reaper, the ghost who had controlled the underworld's information and finances for a decade, but had never appeared in person. Rumor had it the Reaper was failing, their empire glitching, a weakness Grant intended to exploit to seize total control. "Gentlemen," Grant announced, standing before the council. His voice echoed with a polished, predatory grace. "We all know why we are here. The old ways are dying. The Reaper has gone silent, their systems are failing, and my syndicate is the only one with the resources to fill that vacuum. I've brought the legacy, the heir, and the power to lead us into a new era." He gestured to a screen, prepared to show the projected growth of his new regime. 10 years of preparation has led to this moment. I have sacrificed everything to stand here. The oldest member of the commission, a man with skin like wrinkled parchment, looked up. "Sacrificed everything, Harrison, or discarded the only thing that kept you relevant?" Grant laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. If you're referring to my ex-wife, Vivian, she was a housewife who didn't know a ledger from a laundry list. She was baggage. To lead the commission, one needs a shark, not an anchor. Paris giggled, preening under the gaze of the powerful men. Grant felt the crown was already on his head. He looked at the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall, expecting his security team to bring in the final contracts for the members to sign. Instead, the lights in the hall flickered and died. A low, rhythmic hum began to vibrate through the floorboards, the sound of a high-end server farm breathing. On every screen in the room, the Harrison Syndicate logo was suddenly slashed through with a jagged, crimson line. The heavy doors didn't just open. They were thrown wide by two guards wearing the insignia of the Reaper. A silhouette stood in the doorway, bathed in a cold, blue holographic glow. Grant's heart stuttered. The figure walked with a lethal, measured stride that he recognized in his nightmares. As she stepped into the light of the hall, the gasps from the commission members were deafening. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a man. It was Vivian. She was no longer the woman who cried over a burning photograph. She was clad in charcoal gray tactical silk, her gaze so cold it seemed to freeze the blood in Grant's veins. "You're right about one thing, Grant," Vivian's voice rang out, devoid of any warmth. "The Reaper has been silent, but only because I was busy preparing your funeral." The heavy oak doors of the High Commission's inner sanctum groaned as the guards pulled them open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the palpable tension of a kingdom about to be handed over. Grant Harrison stood at the head of the long mahogany table, his chest puffed out, a smug grin plastered across his face. He had spent the last few weeks watching his world crumble, but he believed this one moment would fix it all. If the commission named him the king of the underworld, the lost millions and the logistical glitches wouldn't matter. "Gentlemen," Grant's voice boomed, projecting a confidence he didn't truly feel. "The Harrison Syndicate has the infrastructure, the history, and now, with my son Leo, the guaranteed bloodline to lead this council for the next 50 years. Paris sat in a velvet chair just behind him, wearing a look of practiced humility, though her eyes flickered with the greed of a woman who thought she had successfully usurped a throne. "A bloodline built on a lie is nothing but a rope of sand, Grant." The voice didn't come from the table. It came from the doorway. The room went deathly silent. Grant's smile didn't just fade, it curdled. He turned slowly, his eyes widening as a woman stepped out of the shadows and into the harsh light of the chandelier. It wasn't the broken, tearful wife he had discarded in a burning house. This woman wore a suit of midnight blue silk that moved like liquid shadow. Her hair was pulled back in a sharp, lethal blade of a ponytail, and her gaze held the cold, calculating precision of a predator. "Vivian," Grant stammered, his voice cracking. You're dead. You're supposed to be in the dirt." "You always did have a problem with perception, Grant," Vivian said, her voice smooth and dangerous, echoing off the high ceilings. She didn't stop at the door. She walked with slow, rhythmic purpose toward the head of the table. The seasoned mob bosses at the table, men who feared no one, actually stood up as she approached. "She's a trespasser," Paris shrieked, her composure breaking as she sensed the shift in the room. "Guards, throw this housewife out." The guards didn't move. In fact, they bowed their heads. Vivian reached the seat directly opposite Grant. She didn't look at Paris. She didn't even acknowledge her existence. She looked straight at the elders of the commission. "The man you see before you is a ghost," Vivian announced, leaning forward and resting her hands on the table. "He thinks he's pitching for a seat. He doesn't realize that the Silent Reaper, the one who provides your intelligence, your encryption, and your black market keys, has already revoked his clearance." She pulled a sleek black device from her pocket and tapped the screen. Simultaneously, every monitor in the room flickered to life, displaying Grant's drained accounts and the true origin of his power. "I didn't just build your throne, Grant," she whispered, the coldness in her eyes finally reaching her lips in a dark smile. "I own the room it sits in." The heavy oak doors of the commission chamber creaked shut, sealing Grant Harrison inside a tomb of his own making. He stood at the center of the marble floor, his eyes darting from the high-ranking bosses to the woman he had once called his wife. Vivian sat at the head of the table, her silhouette sharp and lethal against the cold blue light of the monitors. Paris stood by Grant's side, her fingers trembling as she clutched his arm. "Grant, don't listen to her. She's just a bitter woman trying to steal your legacy because she couldn't give you one." Vivian didn't raise her voice. She simply tapped a key on her laptop. "A legacy is built on blood, Grant, but it helps if the blood is actually yours." A giant medical report flickered onto the screens surrounding the room. Grant's eyes scanned the bold red text at the bottom. Probability of paternity, 0%. "What is this?" Grant whispered, his face draining of color. He looked down at Leo, who was being held by a security guard at the back of the room. "That's my son. He looks just like me." "He looks like what you wanted to see," Vivian countered, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "You were so desperate for an heir to validate your ego that you didn't even notice the timing was impossible. You were in London when Leo was conceived, Grant. But do you know who was in the same hotel as Paris in Marseille?" A second document appeared, a surveillance still of Paris entering a room with Lucien, the head of the rival Cavani syndicate. Paris's confident mask shattered. "Grant, I can explain. I did it for us to give you the power you needed." "You brought a spy into my home," Vivian said, standing up and walking slowly toward them. Each click of her heels sounded like a gavel. "You brought a cuckoo bird into my nest and expected me to feed it. Paris didn't just bring you a son, Grant. She brought a tracking device in the form of a child. Every move you made for the last 6 months, every shipment you logged, went straight to the Cavanis." Grant turned to Paris, his hand lifting as if to strike her, but the commission's guards stepped forward, their weapons drawn. He was no longer a boss, he was a liability. "You traded 10 years of my loyalty for a fraud," Vivian said, standing inches from him. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, sleek drive. "I've spent the last 48 hours purging your accounts. You aren't just a failure as a husband, Grant. You're a failure as a mafia boss. You're bankrupt, you're heirless, and as of this moment." She paused, a cold, satisfied smile touching her lips. "You're irrelevant." Grant fell to his knees, the weight of his monumental stupidity finally crushing him. He looked up at the woman he had called a housewife, realizing too late that while he was playing with a mistress, his wife had been playing for the world. The heavy oak doors of the Harrison boardroom didn't just open, they were breached. Federal agents and Interpol officers flooded the room, their boots echoing like a funeral march against the polished marble. At the head of the table, Grant Harrison stood frozen, his face a mask of pale, sweating disbelief. In his hand was a glass of scotch he had poured to celebrate a victory that would now never come. "Grant Harrison, you are under arrest for racketeering, money laundering, and international arms trafficking," the lead agent barked, his voice cutting through the suffocating silence. Grant looked around the room, his eyes darting to his most loyal capos, but no one moved. His men, who once bowed at his feet, now looked away. They had already seen the digital ledgers Vivian had leaked, the evidence that Grant had skimmed off their own families to fund Paris's luxury lifestyle. The loyalty he thought he had bought with fear had evaporated the moment Vivian exposed his incompetence. "Vivian, wait!" Grant shouted as he saw her standing by the window, her silhouette sharp against the city skyline she now controlled. "I did this for the family, for the legacy, for Leo." Vivian turned slowly, her expression as cold as the glass she held. "There is no legacy, Grant. I ran a DNA test. Leo isn't yours. He's the son of the rival boss you thought you outsmarted." The color drained from Grant's face as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The weight of the metal was the only thing holding him upright. The betrayal he had invited into their home had been a Trojan horse, and he had been too blinded by his own ego to see it. As he was dragged toward the exit, he passed Paris, who was being led away in separate restraints, her red dress torn and her smug smile replaced by hysterical tears. Grant's eyes met Vivian's one last time. He looked for a flicker of the woman who had spent 10 years cooking his meals and warming his bed, but she was gone. In her place was the silent reaper, the woman who had dismantled an empire in a single weekend. "You told me I was just the estate manager, Grant," she said, her voice barely a whisper yet filling the entire room. So I managed the estate. I sold it. As the elevator doors closed on Grant Harrison, the House of Harrison ceased to exist. He wasn't just losing his freedom, he was being erased. Outside, the sirens wailed, signaling the end of an era. Vivian watched the flashing blue and red lights from above, feeling the weight of 10 years finally lift. The fire she had started was finally out, and from the ashes, she was the only one left standing. The sterilized white walls of the private recovery suite felt like a different world compared to the dark, smoke-filled boardrooms Vivian had dismantled only hours before. The chaos of the Harrison Syndicate's collapse and the high-stakes revelation of the Silent Reaper felt a lifetime away. Here, the only sound was the rhythmic hum of the heart monitor and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the bundle in her arms. Vivian looked down at her newborn daughter, a tiny miracle who had survived the stress of betrayal and the violence of the underworld. The baby's hand, no larger than a petal, curled around Vivian's thumb. In that touch, Vivian felt a surge of a power she had never known, not the cold, digital power of a cyber-intelligence broker, but the fierce, primal strength of a mother. "It's just us now," Vivian whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she had suppressed for 10 years. For a decade, she had played the role of a submissive wife, believing that her strength lay in her silence and her ability to anchor a man like Grant. She had been wrong. Her true strength wasn't in her restraint, it was in her resilience. She had survived being used as a human shield, she had survived the erasure of her dignity, and she had birthed a new life while tearing down a criminal empire. A soft knock at the door broke her reverie. Her lead operative stood in the doorway, nodding respectfully. "The assets have been fully seized, ma'am. Grant Harrison is officially a ghost in his own city. The authorities are processing Paris's files as we speak. What are your orders?" Vivian didn't look up from her daughter. The burning rage that had fueled her for months had settled into a calm, immovable resolve. The woman who had cried over a burning wedding photo was gone, consumed by the same flames she had used to ignite her revenge. "Let them rot," Vivian said, her tone as sharp as a diamond. "Grant wanted a legacy. Now he has one. He's the man who lost everything because he couldn't recognize the queen sitting at his own table. We move forward. Ensure the Lynn Medical Group gets the anonymous donation for the neonatal wing. My daughter will grow up in a world where we hold the keys, not the shadows." As the operative retreated, Vivian leaned down and kissed her daughter's forehead. She wasn't just a survivor anymore, she was an architect. The betrayal had intended to break her, but it had only served to strip away the housewife mask, revealing the most dangerous version of herself. For 10 years, she had been a shadow behind a small man. Now, she was the sun, and the empire she would build for her child would never be touched by a man like Grant Harrison again. Under the soft hospital lights, the Silent Reaper had finally found her peace, and it was the most powerful weapon of all. The rain that washed over the city that night felt less like a storm and more like a baptism. Standing on the glass-walled balcony of the Harrison, now the Lynn Harrison Executive Suite, Vivian looked out at the sprawling neon arteries of the city she now owned. In her arms, her daughter slept soundly, tucked against the warmth of a cashmere wrap, oblivious to the fact that her mother had just dismantled an empire to build her a fortress. Grant Harrison was gone. The man who had once stood in this very office, looking down at Vivian as if she were a piece of furniture that had outlived its usefulness, was now a ghost in the system. After the commission meeting, his assets hadn't just been frozen. They had been systematically rerouted into a trust for the very child he had tried to discard. The Silent Reaper hadn't just taken his money, she had erased his legacy. The name Harrison no longer commanded fear, it commanded pity. The door to the office opened softly. Her lead strategist, a man who had once served Grant but had long been Vivian's secret eyes, bowed his head. "The transition is complete, Miss Lynn. Every captain has sworn fealty. The rival families who tried to use Paris Jordan as a mole have been neutralized from the market. The city is quiet." Vivian didn't turn around. She watched her reflection in the glass, no longer the tear-streaked woman burning a wedding photo, but a queen in a tailored charcoal suit, her gaze as sharp as a surgical blade. "And the woman?" she asked, her voice a calm, lethal silk. "Paris Jordan has been exposed for the academic and social fraud she is. Without Grant's protection, She's facing federal charges for the espionage she conducted against the syndicate. She's currently begging for a meeting. Let her beg, Vivian said, a small, cold smile touching her lips. She wanted the life I had. Now she can have the ending I refuse to accept. Vivian turned back to the room, the heavy mahogany desk now cleared of Grant's clutter. She sat in the high-backed leather chair, the weight of the city's underground and its technological future resting firmly in her hands. She had spent 10 years playing the part of a shadow, a submissive wife who dimmed her own brilliance to satisfy a man's fragile ego. Never again. As the sun began to peek through the clouds, casting a golden light over the skyline, Vivian realized that the betrayal hadn't been her downfall, it had been her liberation. She wasn't just a survivor of a mafia marriage. She was the architect of a new era. The city didn't belong to the loudest man in the room anymore. It belonged to the woman who knew every secret it hid. Vivian Lynn was no longer a Harrison. She was the new queen, and her reign had only just begun. Vivian spent 10 years building a throne for a man who didn't even give her a seat at the table. Her story is a reminder. Never dim your light just so someone else can feel bright. Grant thought he was bringing home a legacy, but he only brought home his own destruction. If you cheered when Vivian reclaimed her crown, then you belong here with us. Subscribe to Stand with the Strong. Like this video if you believe in the power of a woman's revenge, and share this with anyone who needs to remember their own worth. Comment Reaper below to show Grant he picked the wrong fight, and turn on those post notifications so you never miss the next chapter of justice. You are the architect of your own empire. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise.